Welcome back to Movie Recaps. Today I'll share with you a soft comedy film from 1950 based on a story written by Ted Allen, which has also been published as a children's book under the title Willie the Squouse. This movie is also known as A Christmas Wish. The film begins with a signboard outside a house saying home of the world's greatest entertainer, Rupert, available for parties, songs, and picnics, with a footnote telling the name of his trainer, Joe Mahoney. Inside, Joe is training a red squirrel dressed in a kilt and a hat. The squirrel is called Rupert. Joe gives a pep talk to Rupert, telling him that he's going to get his big break in Hollywood. Joe begins to play a song about Rupert, and Rupert dances along, perfectly acting according to the lyrics. He taps his little feet and dances to Joe's tune. A man enters the house with his wife. Joe welcomes him excitedly and asks Rupert to say hello to him. Rupert gestures hello. When the man asks about the entertaining animal he was invited to look at, Joe says it's Rupert. The man is not impressed and says that no one would want to see a squirrel perform. If it were a lion, he could give Joe his big break, but not for a squirrel. Rupert isn't box office, he says, and leaves. Disheartened, Joe packs his stuff and leaves, taking the signboard with him. Joe goes to a nearby park and tells Rupert to join the other squirrels. Rupert isn't willing to leave. Joe thinks his outfit is stopping him to merge with the other squirrels, so he takes off his clothing and lets him go. Meanwhile, Louis Amendola gets off the train at a nearby station. His daughter, Rosalinda, whom they call Rosie, doesn't have shoes. She can hardly walk in the shoes her father bought her last year as they are too tight. Joe runs into the Amendolas. At first, Louis brags about their fake trips across the world. But when Joe tells him about his financial state, Mr. Amendola tells Joe that they are broke and don't even have any place to stay. Joe tells them about the room at Frank Dingle's house that he just vacated. When Joey learns Joe didn't pay the rent for 6 months, he hastens towards the house as they don't have any money to pay the rent. Meanwhile, Rupert is having a hard time settling into the wild life. He barely survives a dog attack and goes into an owl's nest. Finally, he makes his way back to his old residence and hides in the attic. He finds food there and listens to Pete playing his saxophone. Pete is Mr. Frank Dingle's son. Louis enters with his family. Pete falls for his beautiful daughter Rosie at first sight and agrees to let them rent the house. Louis pretends to be a very successful artist and inspects the house. Pete lets them stay without taking the rent in advance, despite his father's strict advice. When Pete goes towards his home next door, he finds the postman and receives mail for his father. The Amendolas settle in. Mr. and Mrs. Amendola call each other Mama and Papa. Mama tells Papa about the hole in the ceiling. But Papa, as optimistic as he is, says that it only means that if it snows, they will have a white Christmas, inside the house as well as outside. Pete goes to his house and tells his father about the new tenants. When Mr. Dingle asks for the advance rent, Pete tells him that they are really nice people and they will definitely pay their rent. Rosie knocks at the door and Pete opens. She tells him that Pete forgot to give them the house keys. Pete gives her the keys, but when his father asks who's at the door, he tells Rosie to wait outside for him and comes back to tell his father it was the mailman. He hands over the mail from the bank to Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle opens the mail and tells Pete that it is just an advertisement, but he quickly goes to tell his wife Katie about the mail. The bank has sent him a check for $1,500 profit share of investment in a gold mine 10 years ago. A check worth $1,500 was to follow every week from that point forward. Katie is excited and tells Mr. Dingle that it is money from heaven as it is the day before Christmas. She says they should go to church to pray. Mr. Dingle says first he'll go to the bank to cash it out. Pete goes out to Rosie and says that they shouldn't be used to such a rusty apartment, but soon they'll fix it up for them. Pete also tells Rosie in polite words that his father is miserly. He says that his father is reluctant with investing money. Pete asks Rosie to go for a walk with him, but she says she can't walk in her shoes. Pete asks what size she wears, and Rosie tells him that she needs size 4. Pete goes inside the house where Mr. Dingle tells Katie not to tell anyone, especially Pete. Pete asks his mother about what shoe size she wears. His mother wears size 5, so he goes away to look for something else. Katie becomes happy that her son doesn't have any money, yet he wishes to buy her shoes for Christmas. She asks Mr. Dingle to buy Pete a hand-printed tie worth $5, but Mr. Dingle says he'll paint one himself rather than spending $5. Pete gives his own shoes to Rosie and they take a walk in the town. Rosie tells Pete about their circus. Her dad used to juggle with her mother on his shoulders and Rosie at the top playing harp. Their act got old as she grew up, and so they've been finding it hard to keep it going. Pete offers her to play harp and saxophone together as the two orphans. Pete sees his father coming out of a bank. He wonders what he is doing there, but ignores it and keeps on walking. Rosie asks what job does Pete have, but Pete says he doesn't work, he only plays saxophone. He doesn't need money anyway. Rosie asks if he's walking with a girl and she wants malted milk, what would he do without any money? Pete says it would be an embarrassing situation as he sees a vacancy in a nearby shop. They pass by a Christmas tree auction where Louis bids $1 for the last tree but tells the auctioneer that he only has 40 cents. He gives it to him, asking to pay 60 cents later. Back at the Dingle house, Mr. Dingle is back with the cash. He tells Katie to go to the church to say the prayer. Katie is offended by the fact that Mr. Dingle wants to keep the hiding place a secret from her. Mr. Dingle tells her that he wouldn't, but she's too soft-hearted for their son, who shouldn't know about the money. Down in the apartment, Mrs. Amendola, depressed by their poverty, prays. She cries and asks the Lord for help. She wishes for a place to call her home as she is tired of moving from one house to another just to get rid of the overdue rent. She wants to be able to buy her daughter shoes. Meanwhile, Mr. Dingle hides his money in a crack in his wall and carves a hole in the skirting to remember the place of hiding. The money fills up the attic hole at the Amendola's apartment where Rupert is staying. Rupert decides to clean up his domain and throws the money out. Mrs. Amendola thinks the money is coming from heaven and grabs some to go Christmas shopping. When Mr. Amendola returns home with the small tree he bought at the auction, he sees a big Christmas tree with decorations and presents. Rosie brings out a roasted turkey and shows him her new shoes. Mrs. Amendola presents him with a tie as a Christmas gift. Mama tells him that, as unbelievable as it sounds, this money came from heaven following her prayer. Papa believes her, and they have a Merry Christmas dinner. On Christmas Day, they visit the Dingles. Mr. Dingle isn't pleased to have them at first, but when Mr. Amendola gives him advance rent for 3 months, he welcomes them wholeheartedly. Mr. Amendola plays on the piano, and everyone sings a Christmas tune. Mr. Amendola tells Mr. Dingle that they're going to be very good friends. Pete has composed a tune for the two orphan instruments. Both of them sit together and play Pete's composition on their instruments. Mr. Dingle tells Mr. Amendola that he has always been inspired by artists and wanted to be a singer. He asks Mr. Amendola to teach him a trick. Mr. Amendola asks Mr. Dingle if he has got something to act like a seesaw. Mr. Dingle brings a table lever. Mr. Amendola asks Mr. Dingle to jump on one end while he stands on the other end with a glass of water on his head. Mr. Amendola says that when Mr. Dingle jumps on the lever, Mr. Amendola will fly through the air, flip, and light a cigarette mid-air and land with the glass of water back on his head without spilling a drop of water. So Mr. Dingle jumps, and the lever breaks. Pete and Rosie play beautifully, and Rosie asks Pete if she can take his notes home. Pete gladly says he wrote them for her. A man in a beautiful car parks in front of the house. He has a Christmas hamper and knocks at the Amendola apartment. Mr. Amendola sends Rosie to see who it is. He tells Rosie he is there for Joe Mahoney. When Rosie tells him he moved out, he gives the Christmas hamper to her. Mr. Amendola comes and the man introduces himself. He is a Broadway agent, Phil Davis. Mr. Amendola brings him inside their apartment and shows him their poster. He says that Mr. Davis could give the human pyramid their big break. Mr. Amendola performs a juggling act for Mr. Davis with 5 walnuts. Rupert, on the ceiling beam, catches one of them. Phil is impressed that Mr. Amendola made a walnut disappear mid-air. Phil charms Rosie with limelight and tells her that a beautiful girl like her deserves a beautiful apartment unlike theirs. Pete comes to tell them that coffee is served. He overhears Mr. Davis and Rosie talking about Rosie's break, and he interrupts Mr. Davis and calls him a sizzler who promises beautiful girls expensive clothing, diamonds, and limelight to lure them. Rosie tells Pete that Phil didn't say any of those things. Pete leaves, and Phil asks Rosie out. Rosie asks her father if she can go, and he tells her to ask her mama. Rosie goes with Phil. That night, Mama is restless, worrying about Rosie as she isn't even home at midnight. But Papa tells her to rest assured because she is accompanied by a man and isn't alone. Rosie returns in Phil's car. He makes brazen advances while Rosie avoids him. She asks Phil if he knows any musicians and gives him Pete's composition as her own. Uninterested, Phil takes a look at it and then he asks, "Who's Pete Dingle?" Rosie says that she used a male name because she thought no one would be interested in a woman's composition. Pete looks through his bedroom window and storms out immediately, determined to get the job at the drugstore. The drugstore owner tells him he could start in the morning. Pete starts working as a bartender. A customer, Mulligan, tells him to place a bet on horses if he wants to become a millionaire, but Pete refuses. Rosie comes to the store with Phil and sees Pete there. While she's talking to Pete, Phil lifts her up and takes her away. Mr. Amendola brings home a polar bear rug. Mama gets upset at why would he spend a lot of money on a rug they don't even need. Papa pulls a string in the rug's mouth and it plays music. He says it's a radio in the rug. However, Mama still disapproves it and says they are left with only $500 now. But Papa tells her that he gave away that money to a poor baker in the town. Mama gets upset that he always gives away money in charity if he gets a little extra, and tells him that she mailed the last $200 to pay off their remaining debts in New York. So once again, they're broke. Papa asks Mama to pray for money again. Rosie brings the rocking chair in, which she was sitting in the last time, and Papa tells her to say the same prayer. Mama says Rosalinda needs new shoes, but nothing happens. So Papa takes the rug to return it, and Rosie goes with him. Mr. Dingle puts the money in the wall, and Rupert throws the money out. When Rosie and Papa leave, Mama says to the Lord that she is sorry for lying. Rosie doesn't need shoes, and it starts raining money. She quickly calls Papa and Rosie back, and they collect the $1,500. Week after week, they sit Mama in the rocking chair and make her pray, and the money comes pouring in. Week after week, Mr. Dingle keeps putting money in the wall, while Mr. Amendola invests in every needy business in town. The baker gives Mr. Amendola his share of the profit, so they give $1,000 to a charity for shoes to poor children. Word spreads and it becomes the talk of the town. People sit at Pete's bar and talk about Mr. Amendola. They talk about writing an anonymous letter informing the police and getting the FBI involved. Pete sarcastically says that they should do it quickly as they want to turn in a man for his generosity. A customer places an order for a banana delight and participates in the gossip. He says that Mr. Amendola's girl is often seen with Phil. Mr. Amendola is using his daughter to make money. Pete gets angry and smudges the banana delight on his face. Pete quits his job and goes to a nearby pub to drink. Mulligan, the bartender, tells him about his friend in California who's digging for oil. He's gone down 9,000 feet and they only need 500 more. Mulligan asks Pete to invest $2,000 and hit the jackpot if his friend discovers oil. Pete is desperate, so as much as he wants to take the risk, he doesn't have any money. His friend tells Pete to ask his father and tells him that his father draws $1,500 cash every week. Pete knows his father would never agree, but gives it a shot. When Pete tells Mr. Dingle about the oil proposition, he refuses bluntly and completely denies the fact that he has any money. Disheartened, Pete stays outside smoking a cigarette. Rosie comes to Pete and asks him what worried him. He tells her that he needs $2,000 to invest in an oil digging project, and his father doesn't lend him any money. Rosie asks him what makes him after money all of a sudden. It's enough for her if he just expressed his feelings for her. Pete says that even if he told Rosie that he was in love with her, he couldn't afford to marry her. Rosie insists that her father tells her that when he married her mother, he was broke, but those were the happiest days of their lives. Pete keeps insisting that he needs to be a settled man with handsome earnings to lead a happy life with Rosie. So, she suggests Pete ask her dad to lend him $2,000. Pete says he is superstitious about the money that comes from heaven. Rosie storms back into her house and starts crying. Mr. Amendola, who has been eavesdropping, goes out to talk to Pete. He convinces Pete to at least talk about borrowing money in the morning for the sake of Rosie. The next morning, Rosie goes out for a walk with Pete. Mama and Papa talk about their wedding. A representative from the IRS and a local police officer come to investigate Mr. Amendola about his source of income. Mr. Amendola sarcastically says that only an FBI agent is missing, and soon an FBI agent knocks at the door. The three officers investigate him about the source of his generous charities and investments. First, he says that they've been doing circus for a long time and invested their savings in a smart way. Then he makes up a story that he was snatched from a gypsy king when he was a baby. The gypsies discovered him recently and gave his late father's wealth to him. The officers nod in disbelief. Then Mr. Amendola tells another story that he found a pirate's hidden treasure at a beach. The officers don't believe him, so Mrs. Amendola tells them the truth. The officers ask her to do it for them to believe, but Mr. Amendola says that the miracle happens on Thursdays between 3 and 3:30 p.m. So the officers leave, telling them they'll come back on Thursday at 3 p.m. As Mr. and Mrs. Dingle walk through the town center, Katie tells Mrs. Dingle that if he wouldn't hide all his money and invest it like Mr. Amendola, it could be his name on every shop. Soon, Mr. Amendola will own the whole town. So Mr. Dingle decides to raise their rent. He goes to the Amendola residence and demands a raise in the rent. Mr. Amendola says that is the 8th time he's increased the rent, so he protests. Mr. Dingle tells him to move out if he doesn't want to pay more. As the house is the actual source of their wealth, Mr. Amendola agrees. They fall into a quarrel. Mrs. Amendola stops them from fighting for the sake of their children, as they love each other and soon will get married. Mr. Dingle says he'd never marry his son to a girl with Rosie's reputation. Mr. Amendola hurls the rocking chair at him and the chair breaks. Mrs. Amendola gets anxious that he broke the miracle chair. Mr. Amendola asks her to bring glue and nails so he could fix it. Mr. Dingle goes home to find out that the gold mine is exhausted and he will no longer be receiving $1,500. The following Thursday, the police officer and the FBI and IRS officers come to witness the source of Amendola family wealth. Mama keeps saying, "Rosalinda needs new shoes," for half an hour, but nothing happens. Mr. Amendola thinks that it is because he broke the chair, so he surrenders to the officers. While the officers argue about who gets to take him to his office for further investigation, Mr. Amendola lights a cigarette. He throws it up in the air and Rupert catches it and takes it to his hole. The officers, quarreling over who gets to take him, bring him out of the house. Rosie and Pete arrive and Pete asks if he can help Mr. Amendola. Mr. Amendola calmly tells him to take care of his wife and Rosie while he serves his time in jail. Pete runs to his father and asks to lend money to Mr. Amendola for his bail, but he obviously refuses. Meanwhile, the attic catches fire and spreads to Mr. Dingle's bedroom. He panics and runs to take out his money from the hole behind the bed, but Pete carries him downstairs for his safety. The fire brigade arrives to put out the fire. Mr. Dingle moans about his money catching fire. He sobs and says he put $1,500 every week in that hole that is burning away untouched. Rosie hears and quickly understands how the money came from heaven. She tells her father, and the officers also unlock the mysterious source of Mr. Amendola's source of income. They conclude that Mr. Amendola is innocent, while Mr. Dingle needs to be charged for tax evasion. However, they can't take any action against him until the next tax year, so they leave. Mr. Dingle is bereaved as his house isn't insured. Mr. Amendola consoles him and tells him he will rebuild his house. Mr. Dingle thanks him for his generosity. A firefighter brings Rupert out and puts him in a tree. Joe Mahoney comes back and looks for Rupert. He plays his tune and soon Rupert comes dancing. Joe tells Rupert that he found him a job at a circus. Joe and Rupert perform in a lot of circus shows and soon Rupert becomes the star of the show. Mr. and Mrs. Amendola welcome their ex-landlords to move into the rebuilt Dingle house. Mulligan arrives and Pete grabs him by his collar to ask about his money. He gives him the good news that the hole was welling up with oil and he will be a millionaire now. Phil arrives and Rosie runs to greet him. Pete follows and Phil turns up his radio volume. The DJ plays the tune of Two Orphan Instruments by Pete Dingle. Rosie asks when is Pete going to propose to her and he says, "Right now," and kisses her. Mrs. Dingle and Mrs. Amendola congratulate the couple while Mr. Dingle and Mr. Amendola hug out as their friendship begins. Fun fact, Jimmy Durante, Mr. Amendola, was as generous in real life as he was in the movie. The holiday season is on, a great holiday movie to watch. Like if you love holiday movies and drop a comment to tell us which one is your favorite.